The letter was written in Edmund Hale's handwriting, and the moment Nell recognized the careful, controlled loops of it, her hands went completely still. She had been expecting it. That was the part she had trouble explaining to herself afterward. She had been waiting for this particular envelope since the October morning 11 months ago, when she had walked out of Edmund's Philadelphia townhouse with one carpetbag and her mother's cedar sewing box tucked under her arm like something she would fight to protect, which she would have. She had known even then that disappearing and being free were two different things, and that she had only managed the first one. She read the letter twice. "I know you are in Wyoming. I know the town. Come home and we won't discuss it further. If you make me come to you, it will go differently for everyone involved." Nell folded the letter, slid it into her apron pocket, and turned back to the canvas jacket half-pinned on her work table. If you had been her, if you had crossed a continent on 3 train connections and a wagon ride over frozen roads, if you had spent 11 months building something real and quiet in a place where no one knew your name or your history, and then that letter arrived, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if this story speaks to something in you, subscribe to this channel and follow Nell all the way to the end. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments what city or state you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story reaches. Now, let's go back to where it started. The town of Sweetgrass, Wyoming was not on most maps, and the ones that did include it had spelled it wrong. It sat in a fold of land between 2 ridge lines, the kind of town that existed because the railroad had needed a water stop and a few stubborn people had decided that was reason enough to build. The post office shared a building with the feed store. The main street was unpaved because no one had yet agreed it was worth the argument. Nell Hadley stepped off the westbound train into Sweetgrass on a November morning wearing her second-best dress and carrying everything she owned. The carpetbag held 2 changes of clothes, a packet of letters from her sister in Baltimore she'd been meaning to answer, and her mother's cedar sewing box, which she had not left behind. The box was small, 8 inches by 5, with brass clasps worn smooth from decades of opening. Inside, needles organized by size, spools of thread in every color, a thimble her mother had worn, until it went soft as skin, and a stack of handwritten patterns tied with a faded ribbon. The box smelled like cedar and lanolin, and something she had no word for except home, which was complicated, because home was gone. But the smell of it was still there. She stood on the Sweetgrass platform in the November cold and breathed. The air tasted like pine resin and cattle and something burning far away. Nothing like Philadelphia. Philadelphia smelled like coal smoke and river mud, and the particular suffocating closeness of a city that had too many people crammed into streets built for half as many. A city where a woman of Nell's build could walk 1 block and collect looks she hadn't invited, each one carrying its own quiet assessment. Too much of this, not enough of that. Here the sky was enormous. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected the West to feel smaller somehow. Instead, it was the opposite. "You the seamstress?" The man at the far end of the platform hadn't moved when she stepped off. He was leaning against a post with his arms crossed, wearing a coat that had been repaired at the collar and both cuffs. He had the particular stillness of someone who had spent years working outdoors and learned that economy of movement was the same thing as efficiency. He was also looking at her the way a man looks at a horse someone has tried to sell him when he already suspects the horse is lame. "I am," Nell said. He didn't offer to take her bag. Mac Greer, foreman at the Burke spread. "Mr. Burke sent me." A pause. She knew exactly what that pause meant. She'd been receiving it her entire life. It was the pause that said, "You're not what I pictured." What Mac had pictured, she could guess. Some lean, wiry frontier woman who had been hemming saddle blankets in mining camps for 15 years and could cut a pattern without pinning. Not a 29-year-old from Philadelphia with a full figure and hands that were only now starting to grow calluses, clutching a cedar box like it was something precious. Which it was. "Wagons this way," Max said, and turned without waiting to see if she followed. She followed. The Burke Ranch was 40 minutes north, over frozen ruts that rattled her teeth. Max said 11 words the entire ride. She counted because she had nothing else to do except watch the landscape get emptier and more brutally beautiful with every mile, and try not to think about whether she had just made the worst mistake of her life. She thought about Edmund instead, which was worse. Not because she missed him. She hadn't missed him in 8 months, not since the afternoon she had finally understood, with the terrible clarity that comes all at once after arriving slowly for a long time, that the exhaustion she felt every morning wasn't from working too hard. It was from constantly trying to be smaller. Smaller in the space she took up in his dining room, smaller in her opinions, smaller in the way she moved through his house, which was beautiful and immaculate and full of objects she wasn't meant to touch. Edmund Hale was a man who collected things: fine furniture, imported crystal, paintings he never looked at, women who made him look important. He had spent 14 months convincing Nell that her figure was something he was graciously tolerating, that other men wouldn't be so patient, that she should be grateful for his forbearance. She had been grateful. That was the part she found hardest to forgive herself for. One morning she had woken up and understood that the woman she was slowly becoming was someone she didn't recognize, and she had had exactly 30 seconds of terror, followed by a calm that surprised her. The calm of someone who has stopped fighting the current and started swimming. She was gone by that evening. Now she was in Wyoming in the dark, sitting next to a man who had already written her off, on her way to a ranch where she expected to mend shirts and hem trousers for cowboys who would almost certainly do the same. That was fine. She didn't need anyone to believe in her. She needed them to have torn pockets. The Burke spread came out of the dark the way structures do in deep country, first as a smell, then as a cluster of lights, then as something solid interrupting the horizon. 2 barns, several outbuildings, a long bunkhouse, and the main house set back from everything else as if it wanted privacy, larger than she'd expected. Max stopped the wagon. Workrooms through the back of the house. Mr. Burke will talk to you in the morning. He drove toward the barn without ceremony. Nell stood in the yard and looked at the main house. The cold was a dry, honest cold. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. She respected that about it. She found the back entrance. The workroom was, the first word that came to mind was defeated. Someone had been using the space as overflow storage for at least 2 years. Boxes stacked against every wall, a broken chair, a bolt of canvas gone gray with dust. The work table was good. Solid oak, 6 feet long, but buried under ironwork and a rusted bridle that had no business being indoors. She set her carpetbag in the corner and started clearing. She worked until nearly midnight. She got the table clear, the floor swept, a lantern positioned properly. She found a bolt of decent flannel in one of the boxes, stiff from disuse but salvageable, and ran her hand over it the way you check fabric's been sitting, feeling for rot and damage. It was fine. Before she did anything else, she opened her mother's cedar box and placed it at the corner of the work table. She didn't take anything out. She just looked at it for a moment. We made it, she thought. Not to the box, to herself, to the part of herself she'd been protecting all year. We're here. She was still at the table an hour later when she felt it, the specific awareness of being watched. She turned. In the doorway between the workroom and the rest of the house, half hidden in shadow, was a child. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, with dark curly hair loose around his face, and eyes so large they seemed to collect all the available light. He was wearing a nightshirt and wool socks with a hole in the left toe. He was holding a piece of paper and a stub of pencil. He didn't move when she looked at him. He didn't speak. Nell understood something immediately, without knowing a single thing yet about this child, the way you sometimes know things before you have the words for them. She had spent enough years working with people who came to her already braced for judgment to know that the worst thing you could do was reach before someone had decided you were safe. She reached instead for her sewing box, opened the lid, took out a spool of thread, scarlet, the brightest thing in the box. She held it up in the lamplight and let it turn. Nothing happened, then the boy's eyes moved to the thread. She set the spool on the edge of the table nearest the doorway. Then she turned back to the flannel and began folding. She heard nothing, then the lightest possible footstep. She didn't look. The spool disappeared. 30 seconds later, the doorway was empty. The boy was gone as quietly as he'd come. Nell stood alone in the workroom with the Wyoming night pressing against every window, and she thought, I was not expecting a child. She had not been expecting, either, the particular and dangerous sensation of wanting to stay. Declan Burke came to find her the next morning at 6, before the ranch hands were fully awake. He was not what she'd pictured. She had built an image of the man who had placed the advertisement in the Philadelphia Craftsman's Circular, seeking experienced seamstress, ranch work, Wyoming territory, room and terms negotiated, and the image had been of someone commanding. confident, a man who ran things and knew it. What she got was a man who looked like he hadn't slept properly in weeks and was running on stubbornness alone. He was somewhere in his early 40s, weathered in a way that added rather than subtracted, with dark circles under his eyes and a jaw set in the expression she recognized from mirrors. The look of someone carrying something heavy they'd stopped complaining about because complaining hadn't made it lighter. He looked at the workroom. Something moved in his face very briefly. "You cleared it," he said. "It needed clearing." I know. The way he said it meant he had known for a long time and hadn't found a way to address it. He introduced himself, stated the terms. She had full use of the workroom, 3 meals with the hands, a wage that was fair if not generous, and turned toward the door. "Mr. Burke." He paused. "Your son was in this doorway last night around midnight. He took a spool of thread. I gave it to him on purpose, but I wanted you to know, in case he mentioned it, or in case he didn't." Declan went very still. "He came down here." "Yes." "He hasn't." A stopped sentence. She noticed he did this. Started sentences that led somewhere too painful and turned back before he got there. "He doesn't speak. I need you to understand that up front. He was born without hearing. He communicates through other means. If you see him, give him space. He doesn't warm easily to new people." "Of course," Nell said. He nodded and moved toward the door again. "He had paper and a pencil," she said. "He draws?" Something happened behind Declan's eyes. "He does. He did. A breath. He hasn't drawn much lately." He left. She stood in the workroom alone, listening to his footsteps cross the house, and thought, there is a weight in this place. A heavy one. She stirred the coals in the small stove and chose not to think further about it, because it wasn't her weight to know. That afternoon she left a small tin of colored pencils on the bottom step of the interior staircase, red, blue, green, yellow, black. She placed it on the step and walked away. The tin was gone by evening. In its place, a piece of paper folded once. She opened it. A bird, small, precise, the feathers rendered in careful parallel lines with the old black pencil he'd had the night before. The three-dimensionality of it was remarkable for a child his age. He had understood light and shadow without being taught. In the corner, in the laborious block letters of someone who had learned to write by observation, T. Nell looked at the drawing for a long time. Then she pinned it to the wall beside her work table, where she could see it while she worked. She didn't tell anyone. It felt like something that belonged only to the two of them. The Burke Ranch had a contract with the Territorial Army for 40 canvas work jackets, due by February. That was the real reason for the advertisement. Not mending and alterations, but 40 jackets behind schedule, because the person hired to make them had left for a mining operation paying double. Nell assessed the materials, the timeline, the labor required, and wrote it out clearly on a sheet of paper, which she left on the work table for Declan. He found her instead, came to the workroom that evening, holding the paper. "This is organized," he said, and it came out slightly like an accusation. "I've been keeping track of what the work requires. The timeline is tight but possible. I'll need measurements for all 40 men. I'll have Mac get them. And I'll need help in the cutting phase. The cuts are straightforward. I can train someone." He folded the paper. Something in his posture shifted, not trust exactly, but the first ingredient of it. "I'll talk to Mac." She turned back to the table. After a moment, she heard him leave. One, she thought, not a victory, just one. The boy Nell had learned was named Tobias. Toby, the hands called him, though he could not hear the name, found his way to the workroom's doorway on the 4th morning. He stood just inside the frame, one hand on the wood, those enormous eyes moving from Nell to the table, to the spools of colored thread she had arranged along the windowsill by hue. She kept working. She did not look up. After perhaps 3 minutes, she heard him come closer. She slid a spool of deep green toward the table's edge without looking at it, and kept cutting. 30 seconds later, the spool was in his hand. She heard him settle on the floor beneath the table out of her sight line. She heard the scratch of pencil on paper. She kept cutting. She said nothing because what was there to say? He was here. That was enough. An hour later, she looked down and found a drawing on the floor beside her boot. The spool of green thread exactly, the wound coils rendered with a precision that stopped her cold. He had understood the three-dimensionality of it, found a way to convey depth without instruction. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she set a spool of amber thread on the floor where he could reach it. She heard him exhale, a small sound barely audible but warm. She pinned his drawing of the spool beside the bird on the wall. This was how it began. Declan saw the wall of drawings at the end of the second week. She felt the moment his eyes found it. She was at the iron, pressing a seam, and she felt the shift in the room that comes when someone stops moving behind you. She kept working. He didn't say anything. She heard him pour himself coffee from the pot she kept on the small stove, and he stood there in a silence that had weight but not pressure, and then he left. She heard him stop just outside the doorway for a moment, standing still. She chose not to know what that meant. It wasn't hers to know yet. By the end of that second week, the atmosphere of the ranch had begun to change in ways no one acknowledged directly. The bunkhouse had started producing jacket candidates, men coming forward with their measurements, occasionally appearing in the workroom doorway to ask if she needed anything. Not because they'd been sent, because the workroom had become something they were aware of. The smell of warm canvas and thread wax. The rows of jackets taking shape on the rope rack she'd built from fence posts. Danny Pruitt, the youngest hand, freckled and barely 22, came to the workroom one afternoon and looked at the finished jackets and said, "Ma'am, those are," and then seemed to realize he was about to say something kind to someone he hadn't yet decided to respect, and stopped himself. "Good," she offered. He looked at the floor. "Yes, ma'am." She didn't smile. She turned back to the table. That's right, she thought. Look at the work. She wasn't there to win anyone over. She was there to survive, and the work was how she survived. The work always did the talking she didn't need to. The ice storm came on a Thursday night. Wyoming in January didn't do things by halves. The sky went white at the edges and then across entirely. And by the time anyone at the Burke ranch fully understood, this was not a squall but something with genuine intention, it was already too late to do much about it. The hands were in from the pastures. The livestock were secured. Declan was everywhere at once. Nell was in the workroom, finishing the 30-second jacket, the house gone quiet in the particular way it does when a storm outside makes everything inside feel both smaller and more real. She felt it before she saw it. The awareness of a presence in the doorway. Toby. Standing fully in the lamplight this time, not half in shadow, clutching a rolled piece of paper to his chest. And his face, she had learned to read his face in 3 weeks of careful attention, was frightened in a way that went deeper than the storm. She set down her scissors. She crossed the room and sat on the floor near him, not beside him. Near, she held out her hand, flat, not reaching, just offering. He looked at her hand for a long time. Then he sat beside her, not quite touching, close. He unrolled the paper and held it so she could see. It was a woman. The figure was careful and deliberate, clearly drawn from memory many times. Dark hair, a certain quality to the mouth. He had drawn small flowers in the margins. Nell understood without being told. She stayed very still. After a while, she reached into her pocket and found what she always kept there. A length of thread, this one gold. She held it between her fingers and let it catch the lamplight, the way she had done the very first night with the scarlet spool. Toby watched it. She wound the thread around her finger, then gently around his, connected. She felt his breathing change. She stayed there on the workroom floor with him until the storm began to ease, without speaking, because speaking would have changed what this was. When Declan appeared in the doorway 40 minutes later, she looked up and said quietly, "He's all right. He just needed somewhere to be." Declan looked at his son, then at Nell, then at the small drawing still in Toby's hands, the woman with flowers in the margins, the woman who had been gone for 2 years. "Thank you," he said, and the words came out rough-edged, the way words come out when they're carrying more than their sentence weight. She nodded and kept her eyes on Toby, because some things needed privacy. Edmund's letter arrived 12 days later, tucked between a supply invoice and a note from Dot Ferris at the dry goods store. She read it in the workroom with the door closed. She thought about running. The thought lasted perhaps 20 seconds, and in those 20 seconds she had already built the shape of it. Dot's supply wagon, the southbound train, a new town, a new name. She was good at starting from nothing. She'd had practice. She picked up the letter and read it a second time. Damage everyone around you. She thought about Toby on the floor with a gold thread wound around his finger, about Declan's face in the doorway of the ice storm, about the wall of drawings she would have to leave behind. She folded the letter. She went to find Declan. He was in his study. She set the letter on his desk without preamble. He read it. His jaw went tight. "Tell me about him," Declan said. Not a command, not a question exactly, just an opening offered carefully. And she did. She told him about 14 months of small erosions. The way Edmund had systematically narrowed her world, her friendships first, then her family, then her opinions, until she was living in a beautiful house where she was afraid to touch anything. She told him about the 2 occasions that had left marks. She told him about the morning she had woken up and not recognized herself. "Why Wyoming specifically?" Declan asked. "I sew. I've always sewn. It was the one thing he never touched because he thought it was beneath him." She looked at the window, which meant it stayed mine. "So I went where it was worth something." He absorbed that. "He'll come himself," she said. "When the letter doesn't produce the result he wants, he comes in person. He's charming publicly. Genuinely charming, the kind people believe completely, and he's good at arranging true things to mean something they don't." "What does he want?" "Control," she said it plainly, having it back, being seen as the one doing me a favor by taking it. "That's going to be a problem for him," Declan said, "because there's nothing here for him to control." He paused. "I'm going to talk to the men tonight." She started to say he didn't have to. "This ranch isn't just mine," he said, and he said it steadily, the way he said things when the decision had already been made. "You've spent 3 months making it run better than it has in years. That matters to people here." He looked at her. "It matters to me." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "All right." He went to find Mac. Edmund arrived on a Thursday. 4 horses, 3 hired men, and the particular posture of a man who had never once been told no in a way that stuck. Nell and Declan went out together. She made herself look at Edmund directly. She was shaking somewhere deep. In the part of her that remembered what his voice had sounded like in that house, the specific quality of his patience when he was about to stop being patient. But she had spent 14 months learning to appear still when she wasn't, and she did not let it reach her hands. Edmund looked at Declan first, a quick professional assessment. Then he found Nell and smiled. Nell. Her name in his mouth, warm as always, as if they were meeting for lunch. "I've been looking for you." "I know," she said. He looked around the yard with the expression he used when appraising things. Then, turning to Declan with his seamless social ease, "I appreciate you looking after her. This is a private matter, if you'll allow us a few minutes." "Anything you want to say to her, say it here," Declan said. His voice hadn't changed temperature. Edmund adjusted. "With respect, you don't fully understand the situation." "Then, explain it." "Nell has a tendency toward poor decisions when she isn't properly supported." The gentle voice now, she recognized it, the one he used when he was about to do the most damage. "She has obligations in Philadelphia she walked away from. I'm here because I care about her well-being." "She delivered 38 Army-contracted jackets last week," Declan said. "On time, under budget, every specification met. The territorial commander wrote to thank me personally. I'm not sure what poor decisions you're referring to." Edmund looked at Nell. The warmth shifted at its edges. "Come home," he said direct now. "We can resolve this privately." "No," she said. The word came out steadier than she had expected. She felt something happen in her chest when she heard herself say it, the way a knot releases when you've finally found the right end to pull. "I'm not going anywhere with you. You have obligations." "Name them," she held his gaze. "Name the obligations, be specific." A pause that lasted a beat too long. She had never in 14 months asked him to be specific. She had always accepted the general shape of his authority because the general shape had been sufficient, and she hadn't yet understood that specificity would reveal how little was real beneath it. "I can make things very difficult for this ranch," Edmund said, and the pleasantness was gone. "I have connections at the—" "Mr. Hale." The voice came from the corner of the house. She turned. Mac was there, beside him, Danny, Loopy, and 4 other hands, arranged in the specific, not quite casual way of men who want to be visible without appearing to have been sent. "You'd be talking about making threats against this operation," Mac said, in the flat voice he reserved for stating facts. "I want to be sure I understood correctly." Edmund looked at the assembled men. His hired hands shifted in their saddles. "This is a private matter." "She works here," Mac said. "That makes it ours." Edmund looked at Nell one final time. Something changed in his face. Not defeat, not yet, but the first fracture in the certainty. He had come expecting a frightened woman alone in an unfamiliar territory. He had not accounted for the possibility that she was no longer alone. "I'll be in Sweetgrass," he said, the pleasantness back but thin as paper now. "Think carefully, Nell. This isn't finished." "It was finished in October," she said. "You just weren't listening." He rode out. The yard went quiet. Danny let out a long breath. Lupe gave Nell the same small, serious nod he gave when something had been properly settled. She became aware that Declan's hand was at her elbow, not holding, just present, the way you hold something near something that matters in case it's needed. She didn't move away from it. "He'll work through other channels now," she said quietly. "Legal instruments, letters to the bank, things that cost you time to answer." "Let him find out what that costs him," Declan said. What Edmund did next was methodical. A letter to the Territorial Land Office, a visit to the Sweetgrass Bank, a visit to the schoolhouse, where he asked the young teacher, Miss Ainsley, certain careful questions about the welfare of a deaf child on a remote ranch and the qualifications of the woman who spent unsupervised time with him. Miss Ainsley came to the ranch herself 2 days later and sat in the workroom looking at the wall of drawings, all 43 of them, including the one Toby had made last week of Nell's hands at the iron. The fingers rendered with a detail and precision that had made Nell catch her breath when she found it. "He expected me to file a welfare inquiry," Miss Ainsley said. "I have no intention of that." She looked at the wall. "He's drawing people again. He hadn't been. Not since his mother died." "I know," Nell said. Miss Ainsley stood. "Edmund Hale will find someone else to file it. You need to move before he does." Declan had already been in contact with a man named Rowan Tate, a territorial investigator who worked for the Attorney General's office and who, it turned out, had heard Edmund Hale's name before. A woman named Grace Whitmore had filed a complaint in Philadelphia 2 years ago that had gone nowhere. There were others. Rowan came to the ranch and sat at the work table with Declan and Nell and opened a leather folder without preamble. "He's done this before," Rowan said. "I need someone willing to go on record." Nell looked at the folder. She thought about Grace Whitmore. She thought about whoever else was in there, whose stories had gone nowhere because no one had been willing to stand up first. "I'll testify," she said. Edmund was arrested in Sweetgrass 4 days later. Fraud, coercion, an outstanding warrant from Philadelphia his lawyers had suppressed for 2 years. Danny ran to the workroom with his hat in his hand and said, breathless, "They've got him." Nell put both hands flat on the work table. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she picked up her scissors and went back to the work. The morning after Edmund's arrest, she came to the workroom before dawn to find something on the table that hadn't been there the night before. A drawing. She picked it up slowly. 3 people, rendered in Toby's careful, observant way, proportions true, details chosen with purpose, a woman in an apron with her hands at work, a man in a hat looking sideways at the woman, and between them, smaller, a boy with curly hair. All 3 looking in the same direction. Nell stood with the drawing in her hands for a long time. Then she pinned it to the center of the wall, in the place where she could see it from anywhere in the room. She was still looking at it when she heard the interior stairs creak. The second board from the bottom. She turned. Toby was in the doorway, fully in the light, watching her. She held up the drawing so he could see she had found it. Something happened in his face, careful, complicated, the look of someone who has offered something precious and is waiting to learn whether it was understood. She held the drawing against her chest for a moment, one hand flat over it, over her heart. He looked at that for a long time. Then he crossed the room and stood beside her at the table, close enough that his arm was touching her sleeve. They stood together looking at the wall. After a while, he reached up and tugged lightly at her hand. She looked down. He pointed at the drawing, the 3 figures. Then he pointed at her, then at the doorway behind them, where Declan had appeared in the hall, coffee in hand, having come from his study. Declan looked up. He took in the scene, Nell, Toby, the drawing, Toby's finger moving between the paper and the 2 of them. And something happened in his face that she recognized, the expression of a person who has been bracing for so long they've forgotten what it feels like to stop. And then suddenly, for one moment, they stop. The room coming back, what it could hold again. Toby looked up at Nell. His mouth worked. She watched him make the decision. She knew how it felt, to come out of silence and find out what the air tasted like when you let yourself use it. He said, Just the beginning of a sound, the first syllable of something, Ma. Not a full word, the edge of one. Someone testing the water before they stepped in. But it was a sound made on purpose, and it was made for her. Nell reached down and took his hand and said very quietly, "I'm here." And Declan stood in the doorway with his coffee and his long, careful hope, and neither of them needed to look at him to know what his face was doing, and none of them needed to say the rest of it yet. The rest of it was patient. It could wait for the right morning. They married in June, in the yard, which was Declan's idea, because the yard was where the ranch actually lived. Dot Ferris came from Sweetgrass and cried, and said she wasn't crying. Loop stood at the back with his hat off, and his expression the way it got when something truly mattered. Danny cried openly, and was not the slightest bit embarrassed about it. Mac shook Nell's hand at the end with his whole arm, and told her the supply ledgers for the Army contract were in excellent order, which she understood was his version of welcome. Toby stood between them in a shirt she had sewn from good blue wool she'd been saving since March. French seams, bone buttons, the collar cut to sit right because she had taken the measurement 3 times and gotten it exactly right. He didn't speak again that day, but that evening he left a drawing on the work table for her to find in the morning. The yard, all of them in it, every person who had come, each one small and distinct and recognizable. Dot in her best hat, Danny with his hand raised, Loop with his arms crossed, Declan with his hand in hers. In the corner, in his careful block letters, "Our ranch." Nell found it before dawn, in the early dark before anyone else was awake. She stood in the workroom and held it and thought about her mother. She thought about the cedar box on the shelf, the brass clasps worn smooth, the smell of lanolin and cedar that had crossed a continent inside a carpetbag. She thought about the scarlet spool of thread she had held up in the lamplight on the very first night. She thought about the drawing of a bird that had started all of this, left on a step by a child who had decided, for reasons she would never fully understand and didn't need to, that she was safe. She opened the cedar box and took out a needle and a length of gold thread and held them in the early light, the way her mother had always held them before she began. The way you hold something when you understand what it's for and what it can do and what it has already survived. Look what it grew into, she thought. She set the drawing carefully on the wall, beside the bird and the spool, in the place she had always known it would go. Then she put the kettle on, because Toby would be awake soon, and Declan would smell the coffee and come in from wherever he'd gone at first light, and there was work to do. Some things, if you keep them warm and fed and attended to, just keep going. That had always been the whole of it.